All right, so in class we're learning about, wrapping up World War II. We've talked about the European theater and the Pacific theater. We talked about the rise of dictators and how that comes about. And I did a video, which was another lecture earlier on the psychology of Nazism and the road to Nazism. And I just think that's important to touch on is how do you get a country that becomes like the Nazis, where you get a leader like Hitler and the German people. Hitler, again, I told you guys this, Hitler wouldn't have risen to power if the German people weren't receptive to that, if they weren't wanting that type of leader. We talked about how the Treaty of Versailles in World War I diminished them and put them in a place where they would want a dictator like Hitler, right? But let's talk about the psychology, because another lesson I'm trying to hammer home is that these people were just human, like you and I. Like, we demonize the Nazis, we demonize Stalin and what he did in Russia and Mao and China when they committed mass genocides, but they were humans just like you and I. So anything I can give to you to help you try to meditate on and think on, okay, this is where they were at in their frame of mind, and how can we dangerously come close to that? Anything I can give to you that helps you do that, I want to give it to you guys. So check this out. So reading from The Undiscovered Self again, Carl Jung. I talked about this in my last lecture on this, but he was a German psychologist. He actually lived in Switzerland, one of the greatest psychologists of, I think, the 19th century. I really think of all humanity. And he understood the German people. He lived through World War II. He lived through both World Wars. So he knew, he saw that stuff firsthand, and he lived that experience. So he kind of, as one of the greatest psychologists, he had to tap into, okay, how did this happen? So I always go to him as far as asking these questions, right? So check out this. I'm going to read two real quick paragraphs, okay? The word has literally become our God, and so it has remained, even if we know of Christianity only from hearsay. Words like society and the state or the government or the system, I would say that as well, are so concretized that they are almost personified, meaning almost made to be like humans. In the opinion of the man in the street, the state or the government, far more than any king in history, is the inexhaustible giver of all good. The state or the government or the system is invoked, made responsible, grumbled at, and so on and so forth. Society is elevated to the rank of a supreme ethical principle. Indeed, it is even credited with positively creative capacities. No one seems to notice that this worship of the word, which was necessary at a certain phase of man's mental development, has a perilous shadow side. That is to say, the moment the word, as a result of centuries of education, attains universal validity, it severs its original connection with the divine person. There is then a personified church, a personified state, a personified government, a personified political party. A belief in the word becomes credulity, and the word itself is an infernal slogan capable of any deception. With credulity comes propaganda and advertising to dupe the citizen with political jobbery and compromises. And the lie reaches proportions never known before in the history of the world. All right, so keep that in mind. Now, check this out. In accordance with the prevailing tendency of consciousness to seek the source of all ills in the outside world, the cry goes up for political and social changes which, it is supposed, would automatically solve the much deeper problem of a split personality. Let me pause here. He's saying consciousness naturally always attributes its problems externally to the outside world, to someone else. It projects them, what Jung calls projection. So he says politically, socially, we call for political and social change, not realizing that a lot of the ills of humanity that social change would have changed are consequences of split personality. What do you mean by split personality? Well, I like to say my favorite saying, which is your autonomy as a whole. Your consciousness is not one unified person, or else you would do everything you're supposed to do. You would do your homework when you're supposed to. You would show up to class when you're supposed to. But there's a part of you that cannot be controlled. There's also that voice inside your head, your consciousness, that tells you what you should or shouldn't be doing. Or maybe it says that you're not doing enough, right? Then we get into right brain and left brain. And the studies have been done that, and how literally those are two different personalities living inside you. The right brain wants its own things and does its own things. The left brain wanting another. I can keep going. What about the affective drives, the animal instincts of your subcortical brain? That's the animalistic part of your brain. It wants its own things, right? So I can keep going to show you just that we have split personalities. We need to be aware of that. And there's always a shadow side to you. Keep that in mind when we start talking about Hitler. So suppose what automatically solve the much deeper problem of split personality. Hence, it is that whenever this demand is fulfilled, political and social conditions arise which bring the same ills back again in altered form. What then happens is a simple reversal. The underside comes to the top and the shadow takes the place of the light, and since the former is always anarchic and turbulent, the freedom of the liberated underdog must suffer draconian curtailment. Okay, so what does it have to do with Germany and the West? So the first bit I talked about was the personification of the state, meaning the government, the system, the state. These giant abstract groups become personified. They get made into being like a being, like a person. So they get held responsible. They get held, it's like you turn to the state, right? And so Carl Jung's talking about this because he's saying this is what leads to what he called mass-mindedness, meaning you aren't thinking on an individual level for yourself. You're only thinking what you get taught. You're a part of the mob. You get caught up in this collective ideology. You get caught up in this emotional, social turbulence, right? That all happens because you're not thinking like an individual. And that happens because we start to personify things like the state or the government. You make them into these beings. You make them into a giant father or a giant mother that needs to provide for you, needs to care for you. Our founding fathers, I've talked to you about this a lot, explicitly spoke against that, making the federal government a big brother and a big sister. So when we talk about Nazism in Germany, Stalinism in Russia, you see the exact same things. Jung saw the exact same things. The Nazi party became this personified hero. There's a famous painting of Hitler that was done, and he's in a suit of armor holding a giant Nazi flag on a horse. He became a personification of this heroic energy that the German people wanted. Carl Jung's warning against that. He's warning to the West and anybody that will listen, hey, this is what brought Nazism to their country. If we do this with the state and the government, this is what happens. Now, the second part to that was also that this projection of the shadow side outwardly. Our consciousness always automatically, any annoyance, any anger, any trivial thing you have that you attribute to someone else, any of those things that you attribute to someone else or some being or some other person is usually always a reflection of an internal problem. And he attributes it to the split consciousness thing, the thing I explained about how your autonomy, your unified autonomy is actually a fiction. So that's getting too much into psychology, but what I'm getting at is that was also what happened with the German people, and I can show you. That's why they committed mass genocide on the Jews and Gypsies and whoever else they attacked. They were projecting their shadow, all right? They had this guilt and this shame from World War I. They would not look inward and say, well, this was our fault. It had to be someone else's. It has to be someone else's. Let's project it onto them. It's the Jews. Let's murder them now. You see how that happens? Is if you don't look inward, you have a split ego, you have a split consciousness, you don't understand that there's a shadow side to your consciousness, you start to project it externally. Now you're targeting others. And then you're justifying it. You're finding ways to justify it. They're morally evil. They're the ones that put us in this position. They don't want what's best for Germany. They don't want what's best for you. And now you're playing on these things that I didn't even know I was feeling. And now the German people get washed up in this emotional collective idea, right? All it took was someone like a Hitler who was dynamic enough to express it and play on it and manipulate it. And now we're washed up. And that's why I say these guys were just humans. They were humans just like you and I. Just like you and I. And odds are, I say this, if you read history and you don't read it as the bad guys, then you're doing yourself a disservice. Because the odds are that if you were in Germany at that time, you would have at the least been compliant. I'm not saying you would have agreed with it. I'm not saying you would have been an all-out, superpower Nazi. But you would have been at least, because we see it now. You do this now. Oh, well, hey, my hands are clean, man. I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want anything to do with that. I'm going to turn this way. I can't stop it. It's just a system. That's their problem. It's not my problem. That's compliancy. You're compliant in it. And a lot of Germans were. That's how they were. But that's just as bad as doing it because you're allowing it to happen. You're not speaking up against it. So that's the lesson we can learn from the Germans. It's a lesson we can learn from any genocidal regime underneath a dictator like Stalin or Mao in China or Pol Pot. All right, so keep this stuff in mind. History is a warning, and that's why we learn from it. There's a reason why we're learning stuff like this.